Everyone knows the story of the ship that struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912 at 11:40 p.m. The ship that didn't had enough lifeboats, killing over 1,503 souls on board. Titanic was known to be unsinkable after Olympic had an accident, which didn't cause her to sink, which struck people, giving them ideas Titanic as well is unsinkable. Or is she really? Here, we will find out on how exactly did she sink, what caused it aside from the iceberg, and most importantly, how did it break in half? I have studied countless of times, reading and taking note of theories, especially Roy Mengot's. And now we are finally going to conclude and theorize a new theory on how exactly did Titanic sink according to my theory. We all know how the ship sank. The ship struck an iceberg, gashing cuts on the starboard side. Her funnels fall, followed by the breakup, leaving the people dying on the surface. Three key factors that are very known and one of the most major mistakes that also contributed to the sinking of the ship was the coal fire. It is very known that a coal fire started in coal bunker in boiler room 5. The fire started on the moment she left. It was on fire for 10 days. The area where it was warped the iron, as they saw when they moved the coal to stop it from burning. This also caused the 2.5-degree list to port while she was traveling. This might have helped in the sinking, for it speeds up the seeping of water in, as now it's not a perfect seal anymore. Titanic's bulkheads were 12 meters high. They weren't tall enough to protect the ship, as choice by Titanic's designer and head of the company. Thus, in result, this floods Titanic even more, spilling from one bulkhead to another. As a result, this causes the ship's head trim to increase and sink even faster, thus increasing Titanic's sinking rate and decreasing the amount of time left. Titanic's rivets. These rivets fasten and make two pieces of metal to stick together. They are heated and hammered. This fastens pieces of hulls, avoiding them to break easily and make water seep in. However, these rivets are not fit in for the entirety of the ship. They had to use iron rivets in the bow section, which is a fatal flaw, and it has its own drawbacks, which it will destroy the ship, especially when struck with a strong force in a cold temperate water temperature. Thus, the iceberg, and the area where the iceberg hits just happens to be in the area that causes it to sink even more, where the weak rivets were placed in. The factors that affected the ship was the water, the hull damage, the short bulkheads, and the stress and force acting up on the ship as it bends, making it sink even more. Breaking things 101. Three types of these stresses on the Titanic was tension stress, the forces that tries to pull the ship or a certain structure apart. This is located at the top, which is the boat deck, which is evident as seen from the boat deck structures in the wreck, as it seemed that it had been stretched and elongated. Then here we have the compression stress, the force that tries to crush the ship together. This force is located below the structure right underneath the keel of the ship, where it starts to break. The compression stress was one of the most evident as seen in the wreck. We can see the ship bent at an S-like shape, especially in the double bottom section pieces lying on the wreck. And finally, the neutral axis, a neutral force located at the B or C deck or at the middle of the ship. This force is where it stops the crack from spreading more, and it is where the cracks start to spread as well from the top, which with these forces and with the weight of the bow, it is 34,000 tons, and now filled with water, meaning it has doubled and now is 90,000 tons heavy, with the weight of the stern being 14,000 tons and the additional weight from the remaining 1,500 people on board. With these forces, it causes the ship to break in half. It is also evident in the wreck as the past expedition that I've known what they have said and observed. As they look at the double bottom pieces, they are bent in an S shape that only happens unless compression was present or a bottom-up break scenario happened. So what really happened? Did the ship break from the bottom to top? If so, what caused it? Why did that happen? Was tension weak enough to break the top? Here we will start analyzing the wreck more. The wreck of the RMS Titanic lies at a depth about 12,500 feet, about 370 miles or so. Located south-southeast of the coast of Newfoundland, it lies in two main pieces with scattered debris about a third of a mile, 600 meters apart. The bow is still recognizable with many preserved interiors, despite deterioration and damage sustained hitting the seafloor. In contrast, the stern is completely ruined. A debris field around the wreck contains hundreds of thousands of items spilled from the ship as she sank, and especially as she broke apart. The debris would have been spread across the seabed, and this is where it gets interesting. The wreck is not that organized. It's like a puzzle. First, we get the bow section. We have the stern section, almost completely unrecognizable. Then we get the aft tower and forward tower, the boilers around the ship. The stern is collapsed and very unrecognizable. The starboard 120-meter steel plating is missing. It is either pulverized or buried in the seabed, or is lost during the debris fall when Titanic might have broken in half. We all know she did broke in half, as 70 survivors said so. But as we look at the wreck, why is it like that? Why is it the wreck and debris are so spread out everywhere? Why are there so many debris scattered? How exactly did these pieces come to be? Here, we will piece the evidences so we can look up exactly on how Titanic broke in half and what caused it to. But first, we are gonna study the ship's structure before she sank. Titanic was one of the most elegant ships ever made by her time. She was considered unsinkable, but accordingly due to her size only, and not her structure. She was a strong ship. She had strong rivets, and all the problem was with the bow. They were placed there, and they were made out of iron, since it's hard for steel rivets in the area of the bow. And then Titanic's famous features, her funnels, which are 4 of them. But only 3 function, for as the last funnel's purpose is steam and other ventilation purposes for rooms and many more. One thing we are gonna focus here is the expansion joints. Titanic was built with 2 expansion joints. The forward expansion joint was located just behind the first funnel, and the after joint or the aft expansion joint was located between the 3rd and 4th funnels. These joints allowed the superstructure to flex on top of the structural hull. The heavy shear strake plating between C deck and B deck formed the top of the structural hull proper. Everything above the level of the deck was superstructure and was built of light plating. None of it was intended to take any degree of severe stress. It is important to emphasize that Titanic's expansion joints did not cause the ship's hull to break apart. But as we observe in the wreck, we can see clearly the tower debris is on the far side. How did that get separated? Roy Mengot, Roy Mengot was part of the Titanic community born in the year 1953. Since 2002, Roy began developing the theory after the 2001 and 2005 dives to the wreck and combing over the footage. Looking at the clues from a structural engineering standpoint, the bottom-up theory was presented in 2008 to 2010. His theory was quite interesting. So it says there that Titanic was at a 23 angle. So she started to bend. As she bends, compression stresses and tension stresses act on it as it gets higher and higher to the point that the keel can no longer hold it. So it bends upwards, shoving engines up and bulging the hull. And with the tension stress somewhat spreads over the boat deck and the expansion joint tries to hold it. But as it continues, the expansion joint somewhat spreads over the ship, dividing it into sections. And the bow just pulls it down, and the aft and forward tower act like a hinge. And finally, the stern settles down and goes back vertical and sinks. As it goes vertical, the aft tower, forward tower, and the other sections were violently thrown off. He was in the process of revising it due to the new footage provided in the 2012 wreck dive, but he passed away before he could complete the revisions. So here is why I developed a theory based off his, because I want his study to be known more, as his bottom-up theory could actually make sense, especially with the wreck and the signs of compression stress, and many more evidences that are very evident in the wreck. Here we begin with the discussion of my theory. I really don't want to claim this fully as my theory, as it is just a basis of Roy Mengot's, so more like a study, but I still have to name it as my analysis, based with his theory, so no one can steal my idea, but again this is still his theory which is based off his study. Okay, so to begin with, my factors are the same with Roy Mengot, since my basis is his theory with all the tension and compression stresses are still there and the breakup methods. However, I added changes to match up with the survivor accounts. I still follow his 4 main principles of the sinking, especially with the top-down break that cannot happen, and the debris should land where they should be. So my theory goes like this. We'll start off with the pre-breakup, starting with one of the most interesting testimonies. It is said by Charles Jaugen that he heard a parting noise coming from below, as if metals was parting or was bending. This noise was the sign of compression starting to bend the keel and pull the ship apart by 2:16 to 2:17 a.m. Numerous reports from passengers in the lifeboats heard groaning and explosion noises coming from deep below. These noises and explosions-like sounds is the keel and the ship itself failing. There were around 14 to 20 or probably more people who reported these sounds which they heard. So what's interesting here is that at exactly 2:15 to 2:16 a.m., Titanic was already starting to act up, which these noises were actually the keel bending. So each time the keel bends, it makes these noise, and the steel plating of the ship cannot hold it. Thus, stress on the ship acts on it, bending it even more. Now here is where we begin with the breakup. The Titanic, according to what I know from research, for it to break, it has to have the amount of force strong enough to break it. Somewhere around 32 to 33,000 pounds per square inch. The Titanic before she broke had an angle of 19 to 23.5 degrees, as known by numerous analysis. As she rises higher, she bends slowly as the weight of the bow, which is 30,000 tons, but now 90,000 tons, since she is filled up, and the stern with the weight of 14,000 tons with the additional weight of the 1,500 people on the aft end. These forces act on each other, forming a bending force on the Titanic. The bending force forces Titanic to bend further. We all know the ship has its limits. The bending force which acts on the ship causes it to break from bottom to top. But as she bends even further, stress then begins to form at the top. The cracks radiate outwards and bulges the hull. The bending force shoves the engine to the top. As it reaches the top, the boat deck then finally fails, and both cracks meet at the middle somewhere near the neutral axis. Both cracks then meet at the middle. This finally breaks the ship in halves completely and into sections. This still causes it to hang on for a moment, mostly likely 1 to 3 seconds. Then as the bow then finally goes down, the towers get thrown as the towers were sort of like dragged like a force as the debris get dislodged from their places as the bow plunges down. With this is then what we see then in the wreck, with them distributed all over the place, with the boilers and one section of the engines falling after they buckled from their seats. The stern then just rises, pivots around, and then sinks facing England and sinks down, leaving all those 1,500 people above. So it is actually quite horrifying to hear this, that the Titanic just didn't broke in half into two, but into pieces. It is also evident, as people like Mrs. Chaffee mentioned even in her quote, that it seemed to writhe, breaking into 3 parts, in which it was divided. First, the middle seemed to go down, lifting bow and stern into the air. The parts or the part she meant might actually be the bow, stern, and the towers. And the middle that she meant to go down is either the bow going down or the tower which fell according to my theory. Not saying it really is, but it's a possibility. Then the stern followed last, so it is quite actually interesting that this might probably what have happened. Now here is where we proceed with the forensic analysis and a video of how exactly the Titanic sank according to my theory. So now we have known the factors that have caused the Titanic to break, its background and all. We are now finally going to see how exactly Titanic sank according to my theory based on Roy Mengot theory. So here we go. Roy's work is very interesting for how he got the data from the analysis to the amount of data covered and gathered from each and every research he had. His study and analysis should be spread more. The fact that it matches survivor accounts and many more accounts, and the way the data shows the stern going vertical and this ship sinking alone, just like how the survivor said, is very amazing, and the fact it actually makes so much sense as as both match up. I wish to explore more on the factors on what caused it to break for a ship like Titanic so easily, which is why I use Roy's theory to apply it on my study. Part of the Titanic that will always be with me is that the fact that it will never last long in the ocean. It will be gone as it rots in the ocean seabed. When I was 4 years old, I was so attached to the Titanic from the James Cameron film, and then starting from to watch the classics like A Night to Remember and many more. Titanic has been a part of me for over 13 years, and I have been very fond of it. Ever since I knew it, I couldn't stop watching it. I kept researching it and got interested. Aside from the romance of the story, I got more into its historical background, which is very important to me. I started research a lot on it, from the sinking and learning from more of the tragedy of that fateful night. This wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for my sister and my father, who showed me the movie. It has it has been months now since my father has passed away. He was a great man and a huge inspiration to this documentary aside from Roy himself. I will always forever thank him for raising me up. I would also like to thank my whole family for always being there for me and my friends I found on YouTube. I am very thankful that this documentary was possible because I found out about the Titanic. I would always and I would like to pay tribute to all those passengers that died on that night, especially for all those who perished.